In 2023, a man who ran a catering company launched the largest armed rebellion against Vladimir Putin since the Russian Civil War. No official rank, no government authorization, no legal standing whatsoever. What he did have: 25,000 soldiers, heavy artillery, air defense systems, and a column that covered 700 kilometers toward Moscow in under 24 hours, before stopping. But that's not even the interesting part. The interesting part is what he built before the military: a troll farm, a catering business, a gold mine in Sudan, a diamond mine in the Central African Republic, an organization that was technically illegal under Russian law for every single year of its existence, and was funded, armed, and deployed by the Russian government the entire time. The interesting part is what happened after his plane fell out of the sky 2 months later. The organization didn't collapse, it rebranded. And it's still operating today in 6 countries, having outlived its founder. This video is going to walk you through every rank in the Wagner Group, not the mythology, the mechanics. From the Russian prisoner who was told he'd be free in 6 months, to the invisible architects who officially had nothing to do with any of this. And I promise you, by the time we get to the top, the thing that stays with you won't be the violence. It'll be the business model. Let's start at the bottom. It starts in Penal Colony IK6, Melikovo, or Colony IK2, or any of dozens of Russian penal colonies where, starting in 2022, a man in civilian clothes began appearing. Not a soldier, not an official. Yevgeny Prigozhin. And he filmed it himself. The pitch was simple: 6 months of service on the front line, full pardon regardless of what you're in for, 200,000 rubles signing bonus, plus military pay. The condition: you volunteer, nobody forces you. Here's what almost nobody explains correctly about this program. It wasn't desperation, it was engineering. Here's the math. A standard Wagner assault unit at Bakhmut operated in 2 waves. First wave, former prisoners, designated internally as Storm Z. Their job: walk toward Ukrainian positions, draw fire, identify machine gun nests, expose mine locations. On foot, often with minimal ammunition. In the technical vocabulary of military planning, this is called reconnaissance by fire. Except the reconnaissance tool was a human being. Ukrainian intelligence estimated casualty rates for Storm Z units at between 50 and 80% per assault cycle. Second wave, regular Wagner fighters. Better equipped, moving with real tactical data from what the first wave just revealed. Their casualty rate was significantly lower. This is not an accident. This is doctrine. The prisoners knew they were signing up for something dangerous. Most of them didn't know they were signing up to be a sensor array. And here's the psychological architecture underneath it, the part that makes the whole thing work. The pardon had to be real. If the prisoners didn't believe they could survive and be freed, they'd have no incentive to function as intended. The organization needed them to want to live. That desire, that specific desire, was the mechanism. You are designed to want to survive. That want is the product. But surviving the first wave only gets you to the next rank. And the next rank comes with its own kind of trap. If you survived the first wave, or entered Wagner as a regular volunteer, you entered a rank structure that officially didn't exist. Because Wagner didn't exist. Wagner Group was technically illegal under Russian law. Article 359 of the Russian Criminal Code. Mercenary activity. Maximum penalty, 15 years. For the entire period between 2014 and 2022, the Russian government denied any knowledge of the organization. The Kremlin denied it. The Ministry of Defense denied it. Putin denied it. This legal fiction served a very specific function. Because Wagner didn't legally exist, Russian soldiers who died fighting for Wagner in Syria or Libya or Ukraine didn't die in combat. They died in accidents. Their families received no death notifications, No military honors, no official explanation. Some families were told their sons had been in car crashes. The deniability wasn't just political cover, it was a structural element of the organization. The same way deniability is structural in every intelligence operation. Now here's what actually made men sign up anyway. At squad level, 8 to 10 men, the pay structure was what made Wagner functionally different from the Russian army. A Russian army private in 2022, 30 to 40,000 rubles per month, around $400. A Wagner fighter in an active combat zone, 200 to 300,000 rubles per month, $2 to $3,000, 5 to 7 times the official military salary. This wasn't charity. This is how you buy loyalty from men who have nothing, and how you attract the specific type of fighter who will function in environments where the regular army breaks. At Bakhmut, Wagner held positions that 4 separate Russian army units had failed to hold. The difference wasn't equipment, but the squad level is where you follow orders. Company level is where you start making them, and that's where things get genuinely strange. At company level, 100 to 120 men, you start to see what made Wagner operationally unique. No Russian military command structure. No orders filtering through bureaucracy. Company commanders had real-time operational autonomy, the ability to adapt, exploit gaps, make decisions on the ground. In the Russian army, this was radical. The Soviet-era command model, orders come from above, executed below, deviation punishable. This created catastrophic rigidity in Ukraine. Units that couldn't adapt when a plan failed because adapting wasn't in the protocol. Wagner company commanders operated differently because the organization had been built in places, Syria, Libya, the CAR, Sudan, Mali, where there was no Russian army bureaucracy to report to. You were the command structure. You made the call. Here's the Syria detail that almost nobody covers correctly. February 2018, a column of approximately 500 Wagner fighters and pro-government Syrian forces attacked a position near Deir ez-Zor. The position was held by U.S. Special Operations Forces. The U.S. military contacted Russian government officials through the deconfliction line. Are these your forces? The Russian government said no. The U.S. military conducted an airstrike. Between 100 and 300 Wagner fighters died. The exact number is still disputed. Russia acknowledged no deaths. Wagner acknowledged no deaths, because Wagner didn't exist. The families of the men who died that day were told nothing. Their sons were not there. That's the cost of the legal fiction, paid by the people at the bottom of the structure for the benefit of the people at the top. But here's where the operation gets industrial. 347 days, the longest single urban battle of the Ukraine war, Bakhmut, and the battle where Wagner demonstrated something Western military analysis hadn't seen a private military company do before. A sustained, multi-battalion combined arms offensive, conducted independently of the national army fighting the same war. Wagner and the Russian Ministry of Defense were running parallel operations at Bakhmut with barely coordinated logistics. Prigozhin was publicly accusing the MOD of withholding ammunition. The MOD was leaking intelligence, suggesting Wagner was exaggerating its contributions. Both were correct. At battalion level, 400 to 500 men, the commanders at Bakhmut were operating what can best be described as an industrial assault methodology. Human wave tactics are typically described as crude and desperate. What Wagner did at Bakhmut was more sophisticated and more disturbing. Each assault wave was documented, casualties noted, defensive response times measured, mine locations mapped by the bodies of the men who found them. The next wave adjusted. It was iterative. It was engineering applied to attrition warfare, using the maximum expendable resource available, people who had agreed to be spent. Ukrainian defenders described it as fighting a machine that doesn't care how many of its parts it breaks. That's not a metaphor. That's a description of the incentive structure. Now, if you've been watching this and thinking Wagner is primarily a military organization, I need to stop you right there, because the next rank is where the whole thing reveals itself for what it actually is. And it's the part that explains why Wagner survived Prigozhin's death. If you want to understand how power actually works, not how it's reported, this channel is going to become one of your favorites. Hit subscribe before we keep going, because what comes next changes the entire frame. Here's the part of Wagner that almost nobody covers correctly: Africa, not as a deployment, as a business model. In 2018, Wagner entered the Central African Republic. Official story: military trainers helping stabilize a fragile government. This is true. It's also incomplete. Here's how the deal actually worked. Wagner provided a service package: combat troops, training for local forces, political advisors who helped governments consolidate power. The payment was not cash. The payment was concessions: mining concessions, logging rights, gold exploration access in territories that Wagner subsequently, quote, secured. This is a protection racket operating at the sovereign level. Sudan, access to the Jebel Amer gold mine, one of the most productive artisanal gold operations in Africa. Wagner troops moved in, took over security. Russian geologists appeared. Gold moved to Dubai. Libya, two factions received Wagner support. The politically useful faction got fighters. The economically useful faction got logistics. Wagner extracted value from the oil infrastructure. Mali. After the 2021 coup, the new government expelled French forces and invited Wagner in. Payment: mining exploration rights across the north of the country. Estimated annual revenue from African mining operations alone between $250 million and $400 million. This is the thing that makes Wagner structurally different from every other private military company in history. Blackwater got paid in dollars from the US government. Executive outcomes got paid in cash. Wagner got paid in resource rights, in perpetuity. Even if the contract in a country ended, the mining company kept operating. The combat operation was the sales call. The concession was the product. At the commander level in Africa, you weren't running a military unit. You were running a vertically integrated extraction enterprise with a military security division. And the man who designed that entire system? He started in a Leningrad prison. Yevgeny Prigozhin did not start as a military man. 9 years, robbery and fraud. When he got out, he ran a hot dog stand, then a restaurant, then a catering company that won contracts to feed the Russian army. By 2010, Concord Catering was worth hundreds of millions, and he was close enough to Putin to be seated next to him at state dinners. The press called him Putin's chef. In 2013, he funded something called the Internet Research Agency, the St. Petersburg troll farm, later indicted by the U.S. Department of Justice for interfering in the 2016 American election. Thousands of fake accounts, budget reportedly $1.25 million per month. This is not a military operation. This is an information warfare enterprise, run by a man who officially ran a catering company. Here's the detail that almost every video about Wagner skips entirely. The name Wagner is not random. Richard Wagner was Adolf Hitler's favorite composer. Hitler played Wagner at Nuremberg rallies. The name was chosen by Dmitry Utkin, Wagner's military commander, a former Spetsnaz colonel with documented neo-Nazi tattoos. The name was a signal, embedded in the organization's identity from day one, of a specific ideological orientation that the Kremlin tolerated because the organization was useful. At the architect level, Prigozhin controlled 4 separate systems simultaneously: the military operation through Utkin, the African business network through mining companies registered in shell jurisdictions, the media arm, the Gray Zone Telegram channel, millions of subscribers, openly recruiting and fundraising, and the political positioning, using Wagner's battlefield success to publicly challenge Russian MOD leadership. something no Russian military figure had done since the Soviet era. He was building a state within a state, not a private army, a private state, with its own military, its own revenue base, its own propaganda apparatus, and increasingly its own political ambitions. The June 2023 March on Moscow wasn't a coup attempt. That framing misses the point entirely. It was Prigozhin demonstrating he had the capability to attempt a coup. The march was the proof of concept. The stopping was the negotiation. 2 months later, his plane fell out of the sky. And here's where most people think the story ends. It doesn't. Here's what happened after Prigozhin died. The Russian Ministry of Defense absorbed Wagner's Ukraine operations within weeks. The fighters were offered contracts directly with the MOD or with the newly formed Africa Corps. Different name, same structure, same concessions. Running Africa Corps, Andrei Troshev, call sign Sadoy, Graybeard. A former Russian army general embedded with Wagner since its earliest operations. His name appears in no Kremlin press releases. Because here's what was always true about Wagner. The thing the whole architecture was designed to obscure. The FSB and GRU were the silent structure underneath everything, providing intelligence, logistics coordination, and political cover that the organization couldn't generate itself. Wagner's legal non-existence was only sustainable because the people who would normally prosecute mercenary activity were the same people funding and directing mercenary activity. The invisible layer was never Prigozhin. Prigozhin was the face that was allowed to exist, visible enough to be useful, deniable enough to be expendable. The invisible layer is a structure that predates Wagner, that will outlast Africa Corps, and that has been running proxy military operations since at least the 1990s, across a dozen countries. It doesn't have a name. It doesn't need one. It has concessions. Every rank in the Wagner group follows the same logic. At the bottom, people who are expendable by design, motivated by a pardon that may or may not come, used as censors so that the people above them can survive. At the middle, professional soldiers paid at 5 times the national rate to do things the National Army won't do, in places the National Army can't officially be. At the top, men whose names appear nowhere, who control assets across 6 continents, who built an organization that survived its own founder, its own illegality, and its own march on the capital. The lesson of Wagner isn't really about private military companies. It's about what happens when a state decides that deniability is more valuable than accountability, and builds an entire organization around that premise. The organization is still running today. Different name, same architecture, same concessions. That's the part that should stay with you. If this kind of breakdown is what you're looking for, the hidden systems underneath the world's most dangerous organizations, not the mythology but the actual mechanics, drop a comment with the organization or operation you want covered next. The most requested ones are getting their own videos. And if you know someone who thinks they understand how power works, send them this. Let's find out. This is Inside the Structure. Every week, the systems that actually run the world. Subscribe. We're just getting started.